Welcome to Serial Napper, the bedtime podcast for people who fall asleep to true crime. This episode gets dark, so if you're sensitive to graphic content, maybe skip the nightcap. You've been warned. Hey everyone, my name is Nikki Young, and this is Serial Napper, the true crime podcast for naps. I'm back with another true crime story to lull you to sleep, or perhaps to give you nightmares. On the surface, Charlie Brandt seemed like your average guy. He liked to spend his time out on the water with a fishing rod in hand, maybe enjoy a drink or two, and keep to his quiet, predictable life. To friends and neighbors, there was nothing unusual about him. But in 2004, that picture-perfect normalcy was shattered. Charlie carried out a shocking murder-suicide that left investigators scrambling for answers. And what they uncovered was the stuff nightmares are made of. Behind the mask of an ordinary husband and uncle was a man harboring a terrifying secret life. His own sister had also kept his secret for years, hoping that his violent past was a fluke, far behind him now. Strap in. Tonight, we're digging into Charlie's story, his childhood, the violent family tragedy that shaped him, and the crime that finally ripped the mask off for good. We'll walk through the investigation into his past, the trail of murders that he may have left behind, and we'll ask the big question: what really makes a serial killer? Plenty of killers have roots tangled up in family dysfunction and dark childhoods. If we want to understand Charlie Brandt, we have to go back to those early years, where the cracks in his carefully built facade first started to show. So, dim the lights, put your phone down, and listen as I dive into the details of Charlie Brandt's life and how his sister's secret could no longer be kept. So, let's jump right in. To really understand how Charlie Brandt became, well, Charlie Brandt, we need to rewind all the way back to his parents. After all, our parents are our first role models, and who they are can often shape who we become. Herbert and Ilse weren't born in America. They were German immigrants who came over hoping to build a better life. Not a ton is known about Ilse, but Herbert's backstory, it's pretty telling. Herbert grew up in Germany in the 1930s. By the time he was around 10, he was enrolled in a program for German boys that funneled straight into the Hitler Youth. These kids weren't just learning how to march in straight lines. They were being molded into little soldiers, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, anti-Semitism, discipline, and all the poisonous stuff that came with it. When Herbert turned 14 in 1945, the Nazis were already collapsing, but he still graduated from the Hitler Youth. At that point, Hitler was so desperate that he was sending actual children to fight on the front lines. It's not clear if Herbert ever picked up a weapon for the Nazis, but it's safe to say that being raised in that kind of environment, it left a mark. How could it not? Sometime after the war ended, Herbert met Ilse and they were married. Both of them wanted out of the rubble that Europe had become, so they moved to the States, settling in Connecticut around 1955. Herbert landed a job at International Harvester, a company that made farm equipment. Soon, he and Ilse had their first child, a daughter named Angela. Then on February 23, 1957, Carl Brandt, better known as Charlie, was born. Over time, the family grew to include two more daughters, Jessica and Melanie. Because of Herbert's job, the Brandts moved around quite a bit. Charlie was described as a decent student, pulling A's and B's, but painfully shy. He didn't make friends easily, and some accounts suggest that he was picked on. He was close to his dad, though, and they often went hunting together on vacations. In 1970, during one of those hunting trips to Florida, something happened that may have been a tipping point for Charlie. The family brought along their beagle, who ended up wandering off while Charlie and Herbert were out hunting. The next day, they found the dog hiding in the bushes, refusing to come out. Herbert, frustrated, tried to scare it out by firing his gun. Instead, he accidentally shot and killed the family pet. The beagle was technically everyone's dog, but Charlie was particularly attached to it. Losing him hit Charlie hard, and it's believed that grief stuck with him. A few months later, the Brandts returned to Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was January 3rd, 1971. Charlie was 13 years old. That evening, dinner was tense. Ilsa, heavily pregnant with her 5th child, was upset that Charlie hadn't done his homework. Afterward, he was sent to his room while his sister Angela went to hers. Herbert got ready for bed, shaving at the sink, and Ilsa slipped into the bath with a magazine. Then, the unthinkable happened. Charlie burst into the bathroom holding his father's handgun, a weapon he'd been taught to load and shoot. He fired at his dad, dropping him to the floor, then turned the gun on his mother, who was still in the tub. She screamed for Angela to call the police, but it was too late. Ilsa and her unborn baby, they were killed. Charlie then stormed into Angela's room and aimed the gun at her too, but the weapon, it jammed. In a rage, he jumped on top of her and began strangling her. Angela, fighting for her life, shouted that she loved him, she loved her brother. Somehow, that snapped him out of it. His grip loosened, and it was like a switch flipped back off. Angela managed to calm him just enough to convince him to go check on their little sisters, giving her a chance to run for help. She bolted to a neighbor's house, pounding on the door, while Charlie called after her, crying out that she promised not to leave him. When the neighbor finally opened the door, Charlie himself admitted, "I just shot my mom and dad." Police and paramedics rushed to the scene. Miraculously, Herbert survived his wounds. Ilsa and her unborn child, however, did not. When investigators asked Herbert why his son had done this, he blamed it on the recent loss of the beagle. Charlie, on the other hand, told them, "I didn't really want to. It was like I was programmed to do it." His sister, Angela, later recalled that when he was strangling her, his eyes looked empty, glazed over, like he wasn't even really there. Charlie showed little emotion at his mother's funeral. He was evaluated by psychiatrists, and the findings were chilling. One doctor noted that Charlie didn't have a mental illness, but a moral defect. Basically, there was no medical explanation, just something deeply wrong in who he was. The problem? Indiana law at the time said that he was too young to be charged with murder. A grand jury concluded that Charlie was likely to kill again if he didn't receive psychiatric treatment. So he was sent to a state hospital. He spent about a year there, but never really opened up about what happened that night. Instead, he complained that his mother had nagged him too much. Some people, including his sister Angela, thought that he was putting up some kind of act in the hospital. Allegedly, he had even admitted to her at one point that he could cry on demand when he needed to, when he thought that it was appropriate to, not because he actually felt any kind of sadness or remorse, but because he thought it was what the doctors needed to see in order to deem him mentally fit. By 1972, at just 15 years old, Charlie was released thanks to his father, who pushed hard to have him back home. Herbert never held a grudge. He never pressed for his son to be locked away for good. Instead, the family quietly moved to Ormond Beach, Florida, determined to start over. And start over they did. As difficult as it was, particularly for his sister Angela, who he nearly choked to death, they never spoke of that night again. So, the Brandts weren't exactly what you'd call a picture of stability. After Ilsa's death, Herbert eventually remarried and he moved back to Indiana, taking the two youngest girls, Melanie and Jessica, with him. That left Angela, who was now old enough to fend for herself, and Charlie down in Ormond Beach. The two siblings leaned on each other in order to get by. Now, Charlie, he enrolled at Seabreeze High in Daytona Beach. If you're picturing surfboards, football games, and sun-bleached hair, that was the vibe of school. Charlie, though, he was none of those things. He was the shy kid into chess and stamp collecting, not exactly Daytona Beach's poster child. Still, he managed to make a few friends, including his sister Angela's boyfriend, Jim Graves. Jim was older, outgoing, and into fishing and drinking, two hobbies that Charlie could definitely get behind. The two hit it off, and Jim later described Charlie as a normal, if quiet, kind of guy. He even dated a little in high school. On the surface, he really did seem like your average teen. But of course, we know Charlie was carrying around a secret no teenage crush or round of beers could fix. At some point, Jim learned about what Charlie had done to his mother thanks to Angela. This was the one person Angela decided to let in on the secret. Now, you think that that would be a deal breaker in a friendship, but Jim kind of shrugged it off and he stuck around. After high school, Charlie went on to community college in Daytona, and he got a degree in electronics. He landed a job with Raytheon, a major weapons and electronics company, and he even got relocated to the Bahamas. But he never lost touch with Jim. In fact, on one of his trips home, Charlie showed up with a fishing rod, and he casually announced that it was packed with cocaine. Yep, you heard that right. According to Charlie, he found a duffel bag floating while he was fishing near his company housing, full of uncut cocaine worth about $500,000. Instead of turning it in, he supposedly started selling it to coworkers and using it himself. Jim later pointed out that when Charlie bought a $250,000 house, he paid in cash. Make of that what you will. By the 1980s, though, Charlie's life looked fairly put together. He left Raytheon, he became a radar technician for Ford Aerospace in Astor, Florida, and he seemed to settle into something resembling normalcy. Jim and Angela's relationship, it had fizzled out by then. But Charlie stayed close with Jim. In fact, it was Jim who introduced Charlie to the woman who would change everything, Teri Helfrich. Teri was Jim's new girlfriend's roommate. She was vibrant, social, and the total opposite of Charlie's withdrawn personality. She was born in Japan in 1958 while her father was stationed there with the military, and as a military brat, she'd grown up resilient and adaptable. Teri was extremely close to her family, especially her older sister, Mary Lou, and after bouncing around colleges, she earned a business degree, and she eventually landed in Daytona Beach working in retail management. Now, when she met Charlie in 1985, sparks flew. Somehow, the quiet loner and the outgoing extrovert, they just clicked. Within a year, on August 29, 1986, they were married. Before the wedding, both Angela and Jim urged Charlie to tell Teri about his dark past. Charlie supposedly agreed to share his secret, but whether he actually confessed to her, no one knows. After tying the knot, the couple moved down to Big Pine Key in the Florida Keys. Teri worked as a receptionist for a dentist, and Charlie kept up his radar tech career. Together, they looked like a loving, if slightly quirky, married pair. Friends described them as affectionate, even packing lunches for one another. But beneath the wholesome surface, there were cracks. For starters, they both drank heavily, and sometimes that would cause small arguments here and there. When Charlie drank, though, his entire demeanor shifted. His eyes would glaze over like someone had flipped a switch and turned him down to slow motion. If you've ever known someone who has a fuse that short, you know exactly what I mean. It's like when a shark goes in for the kill and their eyes roll back. Then there were his odd quirks. Teri confided in friends that Charlie had an almost pathological fear of doctors. He had an obsession with knives, and a few other habits that didn't quite sit right with her. She felt like there was something kind of off about him, but without any concrete proof that he could be violent, she convinced herself that it was fine. She was probably overreaching. From the outside, they seemed like a normal couple in a quiet beach town. They never had any kids, thank God, and they spent their weekends fishing, drinking, and living life at the edge of the ocean. Part of that life was family, and Charlie seemed to get along especially well with Teri's niece, Michelle Jones. Michelle was Mary Lou's daughter, Teri's sister, and she was close in age to her aunt. Their relationship was more like sisters than aunt and niece. Michelle was bubbly, ambitious, and smart as hell. She graduated from high school at 16 years old, and then she worked her way through college and eventually landed a dream job as a sales executive for the Golf Channel. By her mid-30s, she'd bought her own home in Orlando. Charlie seemed to admire her drive, sometimes too much. He bragged to friends about how sharp she was, and he privately nicknamed her Victoria's Secret because he thought that she was so beautiful. He seemed to be a bit enamored with her. Michelle, though, had no reason to worry. She loved her aunt and she trusted her uncle, and she welcomed them both into her home and her life. To her, they were family. Quirky, sure, but safe, which makes what happened in September 2004 all the more heartbreaking. Hurricane Ivan was barreling towards the Florida Keys. On September 2nd, Charlie and Teri evacuated Big Pine Key and headed to Michelle's house in Orlando. Michelle was thrilled to have them, turning her home into a little evacuation hub, calling friends and filling the space with warmth despite the storm outside. At first, the evacuation almost felt like a family reunion. Michelle turned the disruption into something warm and welcoming, calling friends, cooking meals, and making her guests feel safe. For a little while, the storm outside brought people closer together inside. But by the night of September 13th, things shifted. The storm had passed, meaning Charlie and Teri could have headed back home, but Charlie wanted to stay one more night. He even made dinner, fish of course, and poured enough drinks to blur the edges. According to Michelle's friend Lisa, when she called to see about coming over, Michelle turned her down, which was unusual. She said that something was off. Her aunt and uncle weren't acting like themselves. Normally solid and affectionate, Charlie and Teri had been bickering. It wasn't the right night for company, Michelle said, and then she headed to bed. And that was the last time anyone heard from her. When Michelle didn't answer her phone over the next 2 days, her mother, Mary Lou, grew worried. Those near daily calls, they were her lifeline, and the silence was deafening. By Wednesday, panic had set in, and Mary Lou asked one of Michelle's closest friends, Debbie Knight, to go check on her. Debbie drove to Michelle's home, and she immediately felt like something was wrong. The house was too quiet. The front door was locked, so she walked around to the garage. Through the frosted glass panels of the garage door, she saw a shape hanging from the rafters. It was Charlie. Debbie bolted, dialing 911 as she fled. When authorities arrived, the scene inside was nothing short of a nightmare. Charlie had hung himself with a bedsheet. But that wasn't all. His wife, Teri's body, was on the couch, stabbed 7 times in the chest. Michelle's body was in her bedroom, brutally mutilated. She had been decapitated, her head placed beside her body, and her heart had been removed. Detectives who walked in described the house as a contradiction. It was cozy, decorated nicely, smelling faintly of home, but all of it was drowned out by the unmistakable stench of death. And the puzzle pieces didn't take long to line up. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors were locked from the inside, so this wasn't a break-in. It wasn't some random act of violence. The conclusion was chilling, but simple. Charlie Brandt had murdered his wife and niece before killing himself. For those who thought that they knew Charlie, it was beyond comprehension. Mary Lou, who had trusted him in her home for nearly 2 decades, said the brutality of what happened to her daughter Michelle was indescribable. Michelle's friend Lisa, who had always thought Charlie was just a little eccentric, couldn't believe it either. Neighbors, friends, even Teri's family, they all thought Charlie and Teri were the picture of a perfect marriage. Fishing trips, boating adventures, side by side and everything. No one ever saw this coming. But as investigators would soon learn, the truth about Charlie wasn't new. It wasn't sudden. It had been festering for decades, waiting for the mask to slip, because his sister had a secret that she had been keeping for years. The crime scene told its own story. Investigators determined that Charlie turned on Teri first, stabbing her over and over in a sudden burst of violence. Then he went after Michelle, unleashing horrors that went far beyond simple rage. The brutality was surgical and deeply personal. When it was done, Charlie retreated to the garage, tied a bedsheet to the rafters, and then ended his own life. The house, once Michelle's safe haven, had been transformed into something out of a slasher movie. But there was one question that needed to be answered. Why? Why would this mild-mannered, seemingly harmless man do something so unspeakable? At first, no one had answers. Friends, neighbors, and even family were at a complete loss. But then, someone very close to Charlie stepped forward. His sister, Angela. Angela had been carrying a secret for more than 30 years. When detectives sat her down after the murders, she broke down in tears before finally forcing herself to speak. She said it was January 3rd, 1971, 9 or 10 at night. We had just gotten a color TV and were sitting around watching the FBI with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. When it was over, I went to bed to read like I always did. Meanwhile, their mother, 8 months pregnant, was drawing a bath. Their father was shaving. And that's when Angela heard loud bangs so sharp she thought that they were firecrackers. She said, "Then I heard my father yell, 'Charlie, don't,' or 'Charlie, stop.' And my mom was just screaming. The last thing I heard her say was, 'Angela, call the police.'" Moments later, Charlie appeared in her doorway holding their father's gun. He aimed it at her and he pulled the trigger. Click, empty. But that didn't stop him from lunging at her, wrapping his hands around her throat. Angela fought back, screaming at him, telling him that she loved him. And then, almost like a trance had been broken, he froze. "What am I doing?" he asked, confused, as though waking up from a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. Moments earlier, he had walked into the bathroom and shot his father in the back, leaving him gravely wounded before turning the gun on their pregnant mother. She didn't survive, and neither did the baby that she was carrying. At the hospital afterward, Herbert Brandt, still recovering from his injuries, insisted that he had no idea why his son would do something like this. That why? It hung in the air for decades, buried deep within family silence until it came roaring back in 2004. The truth about Charlie Brandt wasn't new at all. It had been there since he was 13 years old. The rest of the world just hadn't been allowed to see it. Once Angela laid out the truth about Charlie's violent past, investigators realized what happened at Michelle's house was not some freak one-off tragedy. This was a pattern, and it likely stretched back decades. A search of the Brandts' home in Big Pine Key confirmed their worst fears. Hidden inside were stacks of snuff films and violent pornography, the kind of material that made it clear Charlie's obsession with death and mutilation wasn't new. It had been simmering just below the surface all along. They also found a ton of old Victoria's Secret magazines stashed around the house, which is particularly creepy because Charlie used to call Michelle Victoria's Secret behind her back because of the way that she looked, because he thought that she was beautiful. Tucked away in his home were stacks of medical diagrams and books. He had an intense fascination with anatomy, especially the female body, and not in a medical student way. His fixation, it was graphic and obsessive. Friends recalled how he avoided doctors at all costs, terrified of being examined. Yet he hoarded drawings and clippings that showed organs, surgeries, and dissections. That contradiction, the man who wouldn't set foot in a doctor's office but spent hours studying the insides of the human body, it made investigators believe that Michelle's murder wasn't improvised. It was the final act of a fantasy Charlie had been feeding for decades. And it explained the similarities in his suspected victims. The mutilation, the surgical precision, the removal of hearts. It wasn't rage, it was ritual. Detectives started combing through old cases, believing that Charlie may have had other victims. And one in particular hit like a gut punch: the 1989 murder of 38-year-old Sherry Perisho. Sherry was well known around Big Pine Key. She'd been down on her luck, living in a rough camp near the water, riding her bike around town. People saw her, they talked to her, and they knew who she was. Vulnerable, yes, but far from invisible. On September 16, 1989, Sherry's body was found floating in a canal just a short distance from the Brandt's home, and the condition of her remains was horrifying. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Her chest had been opened and her heart removed. It wasn't just murder, it was like some kind of surgical dissection. Now, at the time, investigators had no leads, and the case went cold. But after Michelle's murder in 2004, the similarities screamed for attention. Same mutilation, same surgical precision, same grotesque focus on the heart. Even more chilling, Teri herself had confided suspicions years earlier. She told a family member that Charlie once came home late at night covered in blood. His explanation? He'd been cleaning fish. But after Sherry's body turned up practically in their backyard, Teri admitted that she never believed him. And her gut instinct was right. In 2006, investigators confirmed that Charlie had murdered Sherry Perisho. And Sherry wasn't his only victim. As detectives dug deeper, they found chilling links between Charlie and several other unsolved cases in Florida. In 1978, there was Carol Sullivan. Carol was only 12 years old when she vanished while waiting for her school bus in Marion County, Florida. Weeks later, hunters stumbled across a metal bucket. Inside was Carol's skull. Her body has never been found. The way she was killed, decapitation, was a chilling match to what would later happen to Michelle. In 1988, there was Lisa Saunders. Lisa was just 20, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was found murdered in Miami-Dade County. The violence she endured bore striking similarities to Sherry's death the following year. Investigators strongly suspected Charlie, but with no DNA back then and no eyewitnesses, the case went cold. And then, 1989, Sherry Perisho, confirmed Charlie killed her. And the details mirrored Michelle's murder almost exactly. Decapitation, heart removed, dumped near his own backyard. 1995, there was Darlene Toller. Darlene was a sex worker in Miami whose body was found wrapped in a blanket along the highway. Her throat had been cut in a way eerily consistent with Charlie's known methods. The brutality, the precision, it all pointed back to him. Investigators now believe that these cases were just the tip of the iceberg. Charlie's job as a radar technician took him all over Florida and even outside the U.S., giving him access and opportunity. And his pattern was clear: women who were vulnerable, isolated, or overlooked by society. The extreme violence, the surgical mutilation, the removal of organs, this was his calling card. When detectives finally mapped it all out, the picture was horrifying. Charlie hadn't just snapped in 2004. He'd been killing for decades, slipping under the radar while living as the quiet, friendly man who loved fishing and beer. Detectives now saw him for what he truly was: a serial killer hiding in plain sight for decades. And for the people who thought they knew him, the family who welcomed him in, the friends who fished with him, the wife who trusted him, the revelations were impossible to reconcile. The truth of Charlie Brandt's life wasn't just darker than they imagined, it was monstrous. One of the most haunting questions that lingers over this case isn't just how Charlie managed to kill again, it's why he was ever allowed the chance. So, let's put the pieces together. At 13 years old, Charlie Brandt murdered his mother in cold blood and nearly killed his father and sister. Yet, because of Indiana law at the time, he was considered too young to be charged with murder. Instead, he spent a single year in a psychiatric hospital before being released back into his father's care. No criminal record, no long-term supervision, just a family desperate to move on and a community willing to look the other way. On paper, it was treated as a tragic mental breakdown from a troubled boy. In reality, it was the blueprint of a killer who would strike again decades later. And by failing to hold him accountable, the system handed him that second chance. That silence from the courts, from the Brandt family, from anyone who might have raised the alarm, it became a shield for Charlie. He slipped back into society, hiding in plain sight, until the mask finally cracked in 2004. By then, it was far too late for Teri, Michelle, Sherry, and possibly several other women who crossed his path. He murdered his wife, Teri, brutalized his niece, Michelle, in ways that shocked even seasoned detectives, and then he took his own life. The investigation into his past revealed that he had likely been killing for years, maybe decades, leaving behind a string of victims whose families still don't have the answers that they deserve. So, what makes a serial killer? Is it trauma, upbringing, or bad wiring? In Charlie's case, it feels like a dangerous cocktail of all three: a violent childhood tragedy, unchecked impulses, and a family that chose silence over accountability. And the cost of that silence was measured in lives. Even after investigators connected Charlie to multiple murders, there are still so many unanswered questions. How many victims were there really? Officially, detectives have tied him to a handful of cold cases: Carol Sullivan, Lisa Saunders, Sherry Perisho, and Darlene Toller. But Charlie spent decades crisscrossing Florida and even working abroad. With his pattern of targeting vulnerable women, it's hard not to wonder if there are more victims out there whose names that we'll just never know. Then there's the question of Teri. How much did she suspect? She confided to her family about the night Charlie came home covered in blood, and she admitted that she didn't buy his fish guts excuse. Did she know deep down who she was married to? Was she too afraid to leave, or maybe too in love to accept the truth? And finally, what exactly flipped the switch in September 2004? Charlie had managed to keep his mask on for nearly 20 years of marriage, so why then? Was it the stress of the hurricane evacuation? Was it Michelle herself, the woman he seemed to admire, maybe even covet a little too much? Or had the pressure of decades of secrets finally boiled over? We'll never know for sure, and maybe that's the scariest part, because when it comes to Charlie Brandt, the horror doesn't end with the crimes that we can prove. It lingers in all of the questions that we'll never be able to answer. That's it for me tonight. Thanks so much for listening. If you're part of the Napper Squad on Patreon, thank you for supporting the show. You'll get bonus episodes every month, plus early and ad-free access to new releases. And if you're not, well, you know where to find us. Until next time, stay safe, lock your doors, and don't forget to tuck yourself in at night, because you never know who might be hiding behind the mask of ordinary. Bye.